It seems every week I'm seeing something new published that offers some reiteration of a case that free speech needs some restriction, some form of the argument that the legal and cultural freedom of speech we enjoy in America somehow has harms associated with it, harms that we ought to consider correcting. The case is often presented with some form of the phrase, yeah, I support free speech, but... Let me stop you right there. No, you don't. It's in the article I'm looking at today. Personally, I believe that free speech is a right worth having and protecting, but alternatively phrased, I believe that properly restricted speech would be better than what we currently have. And as silly as that may sound, it apparently doesn't sound that silly to a large portion of my generation. As our author notes, 40% of people age 18 to 34 believe the government should be able to censor offensive speech toward minorities. This according to a November 2015 Pew poll. Perhaps the pendulum has swung back since, but if recent events in Berkeley are any indicator, not far enough. As long as those seeking to restrict speech have numbers of anything close to influential, of anything close to enough to start making policy changes, as that poll suggests they do among my generation, I'm going to keep rebutting their arguments. You'll often hear free speech is the master value, the value through which we identify the best ideas and cultivate the most prosperous societies. Conversely, you might say that restricting speech is the master vice, the trait common to all of the world's least advanced, least desirable, least prosperous places. And that's why I care about this issue so strongly. It's not just about my personal freedom to say whatever I want and your personal freedom to say whatever you want, though that is important, and it lends itself to great jokes and dank memes and all the rest. It's because free speech is the mechanism through which all ideas are vetted, through which the best ideas emerge, and through which society advances. Free speech is the brick and mortar of prosperity. That is why I am uncompromising on the issue, and that is why I take it so seriously. But our author today says free speech is just a joke, when laughing is a crime, that is, published proudly in the San Francisco Chronicle. This article is bunk in both premise and theory, and I want to talk about why. This article uses a bogus claim to set up a bogus theory to get you and I to conclude that, yeah, free speech is great and all, but no, free speech is great. End of sentence. So first, let's discuss the story the author uses to frame her theory. The reason why her article title says, laughing is a crime. The foundational premise she sets up is that speech is often more free for some than for others, and that political speech from the left is often squashed. Like the use of pepper spray against Occupy protesters at UC Davis in 2011, or the, quote, hundreds of Black Lives Matter protesters tossed in jail for demonstrating against police brutality. It's interesting no specific BLM case is mentioned here. Any example our author could provide would not include charges for demonstrating, because there are no charges for demonstrating. Only charges for the dozens of destructive activities with which Black Lives Matter is commonly associated. But the primary example our author cites is the claim that Code Pink activist Desiree Feruz was convicted on charges of disorderly and disruptive conduct just for laughing at Jeff Sessions' Attorney General confirmation hearing in January. An appalling conviction, as our author describes it. And I would agree if that was the full story. It is true that Feruz did attend the Senate hearing and did laugh when Senator Richard Shelby testified that Sessions has a clear record of treating all Americans fairly.
Jeff Sessions' extensive record of treating all Americans equally under the law is clear and well documented. Throughout his decades...
And that laugh does seem minimally intrusive. But that's not where the case ends. For interrupting, Feruz was approached by a Capitol officer working his first congressional hearing, and Feruz's resistance to him and shouting upon her escort out disrupted the hearing. It is for that action that Feruz was convicted. Several jurors spoke with the Huffington Post saying Miss Feruz did not get convicted for laughing. It was her actions as she was being asked to leave. Ms. Feruz's comments as she was being escorted out caused the session to stop. It disrupted the session. If Feruz hadn't said anything on her way out, several jurors said, there would have been a different verdict. You have a free speech right to protest. You do not have a free speech right to disrupt the speech of others, including an active Senate confirmation hearing. So her premise is bunk. I'm not saying simple laughter should have been enough to get this woman kicked out of the hearing. I'm not saying there's no conservative effort ever to minimize or silence opposition speech. But the story she uses to support her case is not one of heavy-handed suppression of political speech. That is simply a convenient distortion of the facts. But the premise can be bunk without minimizing the core of her article, because the core of her article is not necessarily attacking political opponents. She's attacking the philosophical basis that free speech proponents, myself included, often cite in support of the concept. When I point this out, some comfortable, reasonable people like to tell me that free speech is a must in a liberal society. They tell me it ensures a, quote, marketplace of ideas from which people can pick the strongest ones. The assumption, of course, is that people will inevitably pick the best ones. Yes, if I see two or more options in any given situation, I will assess which option is comparatively the best, and I will select that option. Call me a good idea supremacist, but I think that's a pretty safe assumption to make for most people. But our author doesn't, and she offers two reasons why not. First, she argues that a marketplace only functions if you have access to it. And second, that the assumption that people will make good choices is an unfounded one. The marketplace, and she's referring to the economic marketplace here, doesn't mean much to a generation facing staggering levels of student debt and a society mired in wealth and income economic inequalities. For this generation, it's an easy leap to recognize that the marketplace of ideas is unequal too. Today's public squares are owned by businesses, and Facebook and Twitter can do whatever they'd like with your free speech. What those platforms certainly don't seem to be doing is much to drown out the trolls and abusers who plague outspoken women and people of color in particular. At a fundamental level, this is confusion about what free speech actually is. It is an immunity from interference. It is a negative right. It is not an entitlement to a handout. Freedom of speech as a cultural value means we as your fellow citizens will not interfere with your right to speak. Freedom of speech as a legal and political concept means the government will not interfere either. But that freedom doesn't mean that your neighbors or the government or Facebook or Twitter must build you a podium. It just means you are left alone and you have the freedom to put your ideas out there and to let them compete. And that non-interventionist system does mean that everyone has access to the marketplace. You may enter the public sphere and present your ideas without interference, but the burden is still on you to make those ideas competitive in that sphere. On an anecdotal level, this reasoning doesn't make much sense to me either. I can't quite follow what the author means. She seems to be complaining that Twitter and Facebook and others control gigantic platforms for speech, which I guess limits access, but then she complains that these companies don't do enough controlling to deal with people she doesn't like racist trolls. These heavy-handed corporations control all the speech, but their hands should be heavier. Maybe I'm misunderstanding her. But if I'm not, when there's a crappy product, there's a market solution for that. You have both the political and economic freedom to make a competitor, to build your own podium, to launch outspokenwomenofcolor.com, and to ban all the oppressive white men to your heart's desire. And I checked. The domain is available. As far as I can tell, her argument here is something like, the market is controlled by people I don't like, and it should be controlled by people I do. Competition controls the market. And if you want unearned control for yourself, you don't get to complain about the unearned control of others. Second, our author attacks the assumption in the philosophical basis for the marketplace of ideas, that people will rationally choose the best ideas available. As for the inevitability of rational judgment, it's past time to put that old chestnut to rest. If you believe in science, You may be aware of the growing body of research about the profound limitations of the human mind to successfully integrate facts contrary to our long-held belief systems. If you don't believe in science, well, this might be why. Usually, people are swayed not by facts, but by our emotions and our social group. To an extent, I agree. Individuals make ill-advised decisions and poor judgments all the time. People often hold unfounded beliefs, lacking evidence, lacking sound reasoning, lacking merit for any number of reasons. But if we grant that premise, that people often make poor judgments, why would we want to centralize judgment power? If any given individual has the capacity to make a terrible decision, wouldn't we want to spread decision-making power more broadly so that everyone has a say, rather than concentrating that power to the one correct decision maker? That's what free speech does. It's the mass-scale public vetting of ideas. No one person makes the judgment about what ideas are good and what ideas are bad. We all do. And through that freedom, the consequence of any one person making a bad choice is minimized. But beyond that practical question of how we identify good ideas and minimize bad ideas, I'm wary of her philosophy because of the authoritarian direction to which it lends itself. It's not only insufferably smug to say that your neighbor is too stupid to make decisions for himself, but if you believe it, it naturally follows that in some situations, your neighbor shouldn't be making decisions at all. If you have all the right answers and he has all the wrong ones, and you don't believe he has the capacity to be persuaded or to make good choices, you might start to entertain the idea that you should be making choices for him. For the greater good, of course. But authoritarianism, in the eyes of the authoritarian, is always in pursuit of the good. You don't hear the authoritarian say, "Man, I love oppressing everyone, advancing myself at their expense." You hear something like, "I have the obviously superior ideas, and I will bring prosperity to the people."
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
Not that fiction is evidence, of course, but the philosophy is the same. Far too many Americans believe our country's less enlightened values of prejudice, greed, and power are more important right now. And once you and Anakin enlighten them at the hilt of a lightsaber, these bad ideas will be minimized to a number that you deem appropriate. If your ideas are attractive, people will be attracted. Control and coercion need not apply. In an economic marketplace, if you create a product and nobody buys it, it makes sense to ask why. What's wrong with it? And why aren't people attracted to it? Well, everyone's just too stupid to see how awesome my product is, obviously. That approach is a prelude to bankruptcy. By the same reasoning, if you create an idea or a philosophy and nobody buys it, there are probably flaws in it. Fix it and make it more competitive. But if you just insist, "Oh, everyone else is just stupid," you get intellectual bankruptcy. The choice is yours. But unlike our author, I believe in your ability to make the best decision for yourself. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to come hang out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Okay.